on your. Okay, great. So we may as well get started. So I'd like to welcome Michael and everybody else here who's joining this conversation. A little bit about Michael. If you've read the invitation to the event, you know that Michael is co-founder of Four Worlds International, and it's dedicated to working with those who are struggling to bring sustainable improvements to their own world or to improve the lives of others trapped in poverty, ill health, social and economic deprivation, or the lack of basic human rights. So Michael holds a Ph.D. in development education and a master's degree in community development. He's a specialist in participatory change and development processes and is well known for his writing, innovative training, consulting, and mentoring. Having 20 years experience working with Indigenous communities and development organizations throughout the world, including Indigenous North America, we are very pleased to welcome him at this point, having just held a commemoration for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And I think all the participants there recognize that we have much to learn. So we appreciate the time Michael's going to spend with us this evening, offering us some guidance as we try to navigate the journey ahead and answering some questions that participants might have. So did I cover things okay, Michael? Anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I'll tell some more lies afterwards.
Okay.
So first of all, I want to thank you all for this invitation and for the chance to be with you and talk about this topic at this time in our history as a country, because we are really at a crossroads. Something really is emerging that it's been a long, long time in coming, 150 years or more in coming. And it's a difficult topic and it's a difficult road ahead. But and it's going to take a long time and it's going to take a lot of work. But one of the things a very dear Indigenous colleague of mine said just the other day, well, I might as well tell you who it is because you all probably know who this is. Tom Jackson, the musician and television performer. He said, why do we do this? Weekends, nights, days, all this stuff. Why do we do it? He said, there's only one reason we do it: for love. If we don't love one another, then we're not going to do any of this. We're going to do what pleases us, because having to learn stuff that challenges the very foundations of who we are, having to spend days and weekends and nights and all sorts of time working on things that we're never sure when the outcome is going to be or what it is, that's hard. I guess I want to say that what I want to talk about is not all the stuff that happened in the past. There's a lot of that. And, you know, we're a country that was founded on a foundation of genocide and crimes against humanity. I know that's a hard term, but if you actually examine what has happened in our history, legal scholars agree if that was happening today, the people that were responsible for it would be called before the court in The Hague for crimes against humanity. And that past is not just in the past. This, you know, for a while, many of us in our country denied even sometimes the existence, but also the negative or problematic parts of residential schools until finally they found the bodies. And in fact, there's a beautiful new video coming out. And at the very end, one of the children's voices comes and says, they found us. The organization that I work for is a nonprofit organization, and my wife Judy works with it. And we have Indigenous colleagues. It's actually 40 years, I'm afraid, not 20, that we've been doing this work. And we work in Indigenous communities, we're still doing that work. A lot of what we do right now is long-term partnerships in which we're helping the community to make a long-term plan and then building the capacity of people in the community to do the plan that they make. And we also have projects in northern Pakistan, in the high Himalayas along the border with Afghanistan. Those are tribal people. And also a newer project that's just getting going, about a year and a half going, in Belize on the Guatemala border in the southern part of the country with Mayan villages. And all the time when we're doing this work, our role is to try to strengthen their capacity to do their own development, not to bring them stuff, but to build their capacity to get their own stuff. That's kind of what we do. And I just want to say that because I've been doing this a long time, and those elders and leaders in those communities, so many, just had a call from somebody today from 25 years ago. These were my teachers. These were the people that, because I really didn't know what I was doing, and we just had to ask for help over and over again, and we made all sorts of dumb mistakes. These are the people that were patient with us and loved us and cared for us enough to allow us to learn so we could do the work that we do. So I've got to say that what I'm going to share with you today, it comes from my experience and our experience, I would say. We have a network of people that work with us, and it's just what I've learned. It might not be completely right or wrong, and if I make mistakes or hurt anybody's feelings, I would certainly apologize in advance for that. Between 600 and 1,000 years ago, on the east coast of what is now Canada and the United States, there was a large group of Indigenous people living, which we now refer to as Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe is really one of the largest language groups. There are Ojibwe and Potawatomi and well, a whole bunch of other ones too. And that language actually includes, as a cousin, the whole Cree language and the Blackfoot and a lot of other ones. Well, anyway, we're way back in history now. And elders and spiritual leaders started having dreams. And in those dreams, they were instructed that pretty soon they were going to get a visitor that was going to come from across the sea, a light-skinned visitor. And when that visitor came, there was going to be immediately a lot of suffering and a lot of chaos that was going to happen. And the dreams told them that your people are not really ready for this. In a way, you've drifted away from your own teachings and your own guidance, and you need to consolidate and strengthen your own spiritual core so that you can withstand what's going to happen, because what's going to happen is going to influence generations, many generations of people. And so what these dreams advised them to do was to migrate, to move from where they were now. So this is a historical fact, that there was a great migration that started, like I said, about maybe 1,000 years ago and went to about 600 years ago, where tens of thousands of Indigenous people from the coast got in big canoes and moved down up the St. Lawrence Seaway and around the perimeter of the Great Lakes in 7 stopping places. This is called the 7 Fires Prophecy, in places like, what present day Sault Ste. Marie and Sarnia and all the way to the west part of Lake Superior. Now, this is important in itself. Like, who gets up and does things because of dreams? That's a little different than the way we do things. It must have required quite something to be able to respond to that as a whole people. But then there was another prophecy too, called the 8th Fire Prophecy. Some of you may have heard it, but it basically said something like 7 generations after this migration takes place. During that time, the indigenous people would almost be completely undone, almost completely taken apart. They would lose heart, they would lose vision, they would lose their continuity as communities, but still they would be surviving. And there would come a moment when the entire planet was in trouble. When the black, white, yellow, and red people of the world, which the Creator made all of those people, when all of those people would have come to where you live, they would come from all over the world, and they would already be living around you. And in order to find a pathway to a sustainable life and to peace, all of those people would need to come together in one circle and follow the spiritual path of the indigenous people, which is a connection to God and a connection to the land. And if they did that, they would find a way forward, a healthy, positive way forward. And if they didn't do that, there would be dire consequences for humanity. Now imagine that, 1,000-year-old prophecies that's saying something like that. And I can tell you from being in really many, many indigenous communities across Canada in the last, say, 10 years for sure, people are talking about these prophecies. And they believe absolutely that they are in that time when they and others must join hands and come together and work together. So the idea of reconciliation is not something that we invented. The reconciliation approach is something that was given as a set of spiritual instructions to indigenous people many centuries ago. And when treaties were made, when the treaties were made, the indigenous people had one idea about what they were, and the non-indigenous people had a very different idea. The non-indigenous people figured that what they were doing was getting the indigenous people to sign off their lands in exchange for, I don't know what, a few things. And we'll give you this postage stamp piece of land. You give us all of your lands and all of your resources, and then we'll make a country there. And to the indigenous people, this kind of treaty making wasn't new, and it wasn't unexpected. And they understood that they were making a friendship, a peace and friendship treaty, an agreement to share the land, an agreement to share the resources. But as it turned out, indigenous people were pushed into very small patches of land, unsustainable in terms of livelihood, unsustainable in terms of a viable place for economic futures. And everything was taken away from them, and they ended up in dire poverty with some of the worst health statistics in the country and many, many other issues. Now we've had a bunch of calls to action. The first one, that Canadian government and systems have been awakening since, I think it's for the last 25 or 30 years, to indigenous realities and needs. And the most recent one is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with their 94 calls to action. And everybody is basically saying it's time to heal these differences. It's time to create the foundations for a better country together. So we have words like reconciliation, and maybe another one you have heard is indigenization. That one, indigenization, means you make a space. We have to make a space in which indigenous people can enter in and really be themselves and really contribute within their own cultural framework, within their own knowledge systems. They can be together with us in a circle and contribute. So universities and colleges, for example, many of them now today have indigenization plans. And so that means they're trying to make a space inside those institutions for indigenous people to come in, for indigenous scholars to work there, for indigenous students to come and learn and also succeed in that setting. And it sounds like it ought to be really easy, right? I mean, open up spaces, let indigenous people come in, open up our minds and hearts and welcome them. Well, it turns out it's not easy at all. It turns out that most institutions that have been trying to do this for maybe the last 7 years now are struggling. And so I was in a conference not very long ago in Cochrane, near where I live. There was about 100 people there, and there were Indigenous speakers. Sorry, I'm getting dry. And one dear friend of ours, an elder named Tina Fox, was speaking. And she said, you know, I don't trust any of you people. I look all around this room and I don't trust anybody. Oh yeah. And she pointed to me and my wife. There's 2 people I trust. Well, that was a 21-year friendship that we had with this lady. She used to come to our house when she was a member of the band council and cry and sleep and regenerate. She's a friend. I'm telling you this because from the Indigenous people's side, it is difficult. They've been hurt in so many ways. We're asking them to come into a setting where it might seem like it's normal. To us, it's normal. To them, it's a foreign country. The values, the reality, the way things function, it's very different. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. So reconciliation is something different. It's bigger than indigenization. Reconciliation recognizes that, well, there's a correction needed. Lands have been taken away, resources have been stolen, people have been forced into poverty, people are in political repression for centuries. You know, they were made it illegal to practice their religions. Their children were taken away and put in residential schools. It just goes on and on and on, the things that happen. And they're still living in conditions today that are the legacy of that stuff. You know, there's still 50 communities across the country that don't have fresh water. I'm working with one of them right now. Like, how can that be in this time and age in Canada? But did you know that in Indigenous schools on reserves, on average, get between 30 and 45% less money than the public school systems on the nearby towns? The federal government gives them the funding. And it started off to be, when they turned control of education to reserves, they gave them 30% less money than the federal government had to run that. But then over the next years, they didn't increase anything for inflation. And now they're down to, well, in Saskatchewan, it's almost 50% less money. So how is it that, you know, their children are worth any less than ours? Like, how does that make any sense? Same with the social welfare system. That's what Cindy Blackwell's case in the Supreme Court is all about. That it's a violation of human rights of Indigenous children to have such underfunding that you can't take care of those children. And it's like that for housing. There's tens of thousands of needed houses on reserves across the country. And it just goes on and on like this. Wrongs that have not yet been corrected. So when Indigenous people are feeling this, urgently feeling this, painfully feeling this, from generations, from suffering, they've seen their parents come from residential school. Now we find these bodies, you know, and now we ask them to come into our spaces. You imagine what kind of a heart that takes for people to do that. What courage, what love, what spiritual maturity to be able to do that. That's quite something, actually. And I've seen them do it over and over again. Sometimes people are angry and they don't want to do it, and they blast you because they're hurt and they don't know what to do with that hurt. So it's one heart at a time, this work. That's really the kind of the bottom line is you have to make relationships to even begin. You can't get people into a space if they don't trust you and if you don't have any relationships with them. So the first thing you got to do is make relationships, right? So here's a story. It's just a little, it's just kind of I guess it's a little, whatever I call it, an account, I guess. Got a phone call from a fairly large college, and they said, we have an Indigenous policy, and it doesn't seem to be working. Would you come and try to help us to figure out how we could get it to work? Okay, well, so I go up to this place, and I spent a day and a half visiting pretty much every senior manager in this place. There's 20,000 students in this place. It's pretty big. So you can imagine a college with is that big. You know, I don't know how many, they have 1,000 employees or something like that. And they have the teaching units of the thing, like the faculty of this and faculty of that, and then the administrative units and the library and all these things. It's a big place. And all of those units, all of those people are all part of the picture of what happens when Indigenous students come into that space, what they experience. So anyway, in going around, I found out that there wasn't anybody I talked to except one or other, I think maybe one person that even knew they had an Indigenous policy. So I said, okay, can I meet with the committee that's responsible for this policy? And so they brought me to this room with these people, and we're sitting there, and there wasn't any Indigenous people in that group. There was about half a dozen Indigenous workers there, but none of them were invited into this group. And so I said, well, have you ever heard of the idea, nothing about us without us? That's the idea that we don't try to fix people or help people without engaging them as collaborators to work with us, to be with us as partners, to figure it out together, because we sure as hell don't know. A lot of stuff we don't know. I can tell you that quite a few of the people, the white people who were working in the college, they had very good hearts and they wanted to do good, but they really didn't know how to do it. So what we did was created a core group of people in the heart of this institution. About half of them were Indigenous and half of them were non. And their work was to begin to figure out a pathway for opening up dialogue and learning and so on. And the very first part of this problem, the barrier that everybody experiences in these institutions that makes it very difficult to move forward, is ignorance. People just don't know the history. They don't have the background. They don't understand what happened in the foundations of our country. And because they don't know that, they'll say things like, well, why are we talking about all this stuff from the past? Like, what's that got to do with now? And why don't those people do this? Or why don't those people do that? About 5 years before this time that I'm telling you about in this institution, they had about 25 Indigenous staff. They had really interesting and good programming going on, and they had 400 Indigenous students coming to the place. And it was pretty lively, and all the communities from around there were sending their students. And now when I was there, they had 40 Indigenous students, and they didn't understand why. Because the policy really said, all those Indigenous people, well, they should just get in line with the other immigrants. They're like everybody else, aren't they? Just so they can come to the same programs. As one size fits all, doesn't it? Well, actually, no. One size doesn't fit all. And so the idea that you were going to bring Indigenous people into this process of decision making, that you were going to bring Indigenous knowledge into the process and have it be an equal contributor to the knowledge that was being shared within this institution. These things could not happen unless Indigenous people were there and helping to do it, and helping to design it and think it through. So ignorance was certainly one of the barriers, and Justice Murray Sinclair, who was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, said, generally, the first step for Canadians is learning. And so I can tell you that I'm a member of a Rotary Club back in my town here. And our Rotary Club took a look at this whole Indigenous issue and said, let's see what we can do with our Indigenous neighbors and so on. So we met and we consulted. We had about 20 people in the room and we're talking about it. And at the end of it all, our conclusion, the conclusion of the group was, what do we say? We don't know anything. We are really ignorant. And like, what are we supposed to do? Run out to the reserve and say, hi, we're from the Rotary, we're here to help you? That's an old joke that I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. I mean, so we decided to embark on a learning program. And so a 7-module training course was designed. It was on the scale, on the level of about a community college course, a 3 hours once a month thing. And we had Indigenous people in every session who were leading parts of it. And the last 7th one was an immersion on the nearby reserve hosted by the Indigenous people there. 53 people attended this, and among them 35 of the senior managers of our town. And that was a very interesting thing, and strategically, because it meant that these people's mind and understanding was shifting, and it has led to amazing partnerships, opening doors that were never there before, that make it possible for us to work, the Rotary Club, to work with the town. So this learning process really transformed a lot of thinking. And it was a very excellent start for other work that's going on now, which I'll tell you about it later. So one of the barriers is ignorance. Another barrier is intercultural, what I call intercultural incompetency. The ability of a person or an organization to constructively work with cultural difference in a way that leads to mutual understanding and collaboration and to good outcomes. That's what cultural competence is. And the problem we found again and again with universities and colleges and police forces and towns, municipalities, is that the dominant culture, the European-based culture, we are culture blind. In fact, many of us actually don't think we have a culture. We don't need all those brown people that have their music and their dance and their diets and their history and their whatever, they have culture, but what we have is reality. And we know we have reality because we have the scientific method to prove it. It tells us what is real. All right, I'm going to tell you another little story. We got a call from an Indigenous community in the far north to help them with addictions, alcohol and drug abuse. And they wanted us to come up and build a program with them. So we went up there. There was a team of 3 of us. Yeah, 3 of us. And as soon as we got in the room with the people that brought us there, we said, we want to meet with elders. And they said, no, you're not here for that. You're here to help us make a plan. And we said, yeah, we know. We want to meet with elders, the most senior elders in the community, men and women, at least 4, but probably more. Well, we don't have time for that. You guys are here, we're paying you. You got to help us to make this plan. We said, we will help you make the plan, but we first have to talk with the elder. We have to listen to some elders. We have to find out from their point of view, what's what. So they said, no, we can't do that. And so I said, all right, when's the next plane out of here? Because we're going. Because that's how we work. And if you guys want us to work with you, that's what we do. If not, you'll have to find someone else. They said, all right, we'll arrange something. And I said, this afternoon, before we do other things. So we spent the rest of that day and the rest of the next day visiting elders. The main elder, the principal spiritual leader elder in the community was a guy named Alexis Semillanta. He was already, I don't know, maybe he was 80. I don't know how old he was. He was really, really old anyhow. And I remember being brought into his house. Now, traditional custom says that when you are asking something of an elder or another person within that kind of way of doing things, you offer tobacco as a kind of a protocol, as an offering. And if they accept the tobacco, it's a kind of an exchange, an agreement is made through that you are, that what you're going to do is on a spiritual level and heart to heart and spirit to spirit before the Creator. We're doing this work. So In those communities, usually you give pipe tobacco to, chewing tobacco to the old men because that's what they like, but tobacco anyway. So I had this tobacco in my pocket, and I came in, and this old guy is sitting in a rocking chair, and behind him is a rosary hung on the wall, and pictures of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And I'm thinking, these people, maybe he's so Christian, he's going to be insulted by this traditional way of doing things, because there is splits in communities. People who have stayed with their Christian ways, with their traditional ways, and people who became Christians. And sometimes they really don't like each other, and they disapprove of each other strongly. And so, but something told me to do this, and I knelt down in front of this old man, and I'd been in front of his rocking chair, and I put this tobacco in his hand, and I said, "Grandfather, I'm bringing this tobacco and I'm asking for your help. They've asked us to come and help with the alcohol issue, but we don't know what we're doing. And we really need some guidance and help from you and anybody else that can help us. Will you help us?" And he had kind of watery eyes, and his eyes were kind of closed. And I'm thinking, okay, here we go. What's going to happen? And then his face lit up, and he had this magnificent spark in his eyes. And he said, "I knew you were coming. I dreamed you. And there's 2 other people with you, aren't there?" I said, "Yeah, there are." He said, "Okay, I'll help you. Let me explain something to you." So he told the story. It would take too long to tell all of it, but I'm going to give you the sum of it. He said, about 20 years before that, or 15 years before that, something like that, maybe something like that, 50, I don't know how long it was before, his wife had died, his lifelong partner. And he was so bereft, so lost. It was in the summertime. And he just wandered around the community for 3 days and 3 nights. And finally, and it used to get so hot in the night that they would take the cook stoves out of the cabins and put them outside and cook outside because it was just too hot inside. And finally, some friends took him inside the house and laid him down on the floor. And he was laying there. He said, "I'm laying there looking up at the smoke hole where the pipes for the stove should go." And he said, "The next thing I knew, my spirit went up, and I found myself standing in between the worlds on this place. And there were people there like spirit guides, and they took me in the 4 directions." And he talks about how he went this way and that way and the other way. And the west way is like the way that goes on to the spirit world. It's like the way for death in the next world. And he said, my guide said, no, you can't go that way. And then he took me over to the edge and he said, "Look down there." And I looked over the edge and he said, I could see my community, all the houses. But I could see that some of them were solid and they looked like normal houses, but some of them were smoky, foggy. They were almost like they were fading away. And I said to this guy, what is that? What is that? And he told me those houses are so out of touch with their own spirit and with the Creator because of alcohol that they are ceasing to exist. They're fading out of existence. That's what these are my words, but this is basically what he was saying. And then he said, "We called you here because we have work for you to do. We want to send you back, and we're going to give you some helpers, and we want you to work on the healing of your people." Okay, so then he said, "I gathered up my helpers." He had 5 helpers, 5 elders. And we've been talking about this and working on this for a long time. But he said, we're all old people. We're like a man with no arms and no legs. We can't do things. No, you guys have come here. You're going to be our arms and legs, and we're going to tell you what to do. Okay. So I said, but I had gone in there really wanting a meeting with the elders, and I asked at the beginning, and I asked in the middle, and now I said, well, what about that meeting with the elders? He said, "Oh yeah, I'll arrange that. We'll take care of that." I'll just say one more thing about him before I leave this scene. Is like I visited him several times, and he at one point took out a moose hide and unrolled it, and it was big. It was like a living room rug. It was huge. And it was completely covered with drawings and paintings, tiny, tiny little things with dotted lines going everywhere. And he said, this is the map of where all of the animals go, where they live, where they go. And then he said, over here, you see that line over there, that trail there? That's where we human beings go when we go on to the next world. Well, all right, so I got to talk with the elders, some elders. We went back to the office the next morning and we're sitting in there working, and I'm wondering when my meeting is going to happen. And we're starting to make plans and talking and whatnot, and nothing happens and nothing happens. And then around 2:30 in the afternoon, somebody comes into the office where we were. And this young guy, and he says, the elders are waiting for you in the council chambers. Okay, so we went to the band office, to the council chambers. By the way, the council chambers are only for the elected leaders. This was a really a kind of a revolutionary act that these old people went in there and decided to have their meeting in there and not in some other place. And when I got in there was about, I don't know, 60, 70 people in there. And the women were sitting on one side and the men were sitting on the other. And the women looked like, you know, they all had babushkas on that looked like Ukrainian babas. That's their traditional way they used to dress. And then they went around, started listening, and they went around the circle. And many things happened in that wonderful meeting. But one of the things that was astonishing to me is they said, I knew to come to this meeting because I had a dream. They were summoned to that meeting through dreams. And that same guy, Alexis Semianta, told me that him and other people in the community still to this day, when they need food and they need a hunt, they go to sleep and have a dream, and the dream tells them where the moose is going to be and when it's going to be there, and they just go get it. All right. This is like, like what is this? This is not my universe. This is not my world. This is not the scientific world that I know. This is not measurable and accountable. I don't get this stuff. Now, can you imagine when people with that capacity and worldview come into our circles? Like, who prays when they go to the bank before they open up an account, or at a government office when they're making a plan or something? But Indigenous people, if they're doing things their own ways, usually they're going to pray before they do anything. They have their own, it is really a different culture and a distinct culture. It takes Canadians or European Canadians quite a while to deeply understand that that's the case. So if you go into somebody else's cultural world, there's hidden rules that you don't know that they're there until you trip over them. And yeah, there's a lot of Indigenous people who are bicultural, but there's a lot who can feel very uncomfortable because they really don't know the lay of the land. They don't want to they don't want to seem stupid, and they don't want to make a mistake. It's difficult for them. So this is all kind of background to why it's hard for communities or institutions or municipalities or anybody to create these circles. You have to go slowly and you have to go cautiously. And you have to expect a lot of learning along the way. Just a few examples of the cultural differences, just to put some of them in place. If you go to an Indigenous conference where they're going to plan for a big important thing, and there's a whole bunch of Indigenous people came from the whole region, and my job, I'm there to facilitate the process and document the process, and I'm ready to go, and it's Monday morning and it's 9 o'clock and there's about 6 people there. There's supposed to be 60. And they start trickling in. Maybe about 10:30 or 11 o'clock, there's enough people there so somebody gets up in the front and starts to talk. And then they talk and they they're laughing and they're joking, and it goes on. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm going nuts because I had a plan where I was supposed to make I was supposed to facilitate this meeting, and it was supposed to go like this: ABC, 1, 2, 3, Ph.D, and you're done. No. And maybe around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the chairman of the meetings, welcomes everybody and acknowledges that, well, we've all had a good visit now. And maybe we'll talk about what we'll do tomorrow when the work begins. But actually that we've been working all along, that this is a part of the work. This relationship building first, then we get to the business. Sorry, I didn't want to lose my place here. I mentioned before that this spiritual part of life and the material part of life are really part of the same reality. I'm not going to go over that. But we have a tendency to what's called black and white thinking. You're either this or you're that. So it's a criticism in our culture when a politician changes his mind. That's called flip-flopping, right? Indigenous people in communities, many communities I work in, there might be 5 or 6 churches there, and quite a few people are members of all of them. All of them, they go to all of them. And they also go to sweat lodges and other things, because to them, it's all the same thing. It's all about the creator. And it's not you're this or you're that. It's one circle. And in our way of learning and deciding things, we have the scientific method. That's a method where you isolate everything. You take the thing that you want to study and you put everything else out of the picture. So only you have this thing that you want to study, isolated from everything else. And then you study the heck out of it, and that's how you understand things. It's controlling the variables, right? Within an indigenous way of thinking and looking at reality and understanding reality, you can't understand something except in its relationship with everything else that it's connected to. In the indigenous world, everything is within an ecosystem of interconnectedness. And so it doesn't make any sense to try to understand what something is or how it works, except through that interconnectedness. Now you can see how that would be a real problem when you go to school and you try to study science as an indigenous student. Or if you're an indigenous scholar and you come into the university with that kind of thinking, and they go, oh, that we don't do that here. That's not what we do. And that distinction, that sort of dominant culture control of knowledge and the unwillingness to legitimate and recognize indigenous people's knowledge and experience causes universities to say, you elder that spent 20 years, now I spent 20 years getting my PhD, and so I'm the one who knows, and now, but you spent 20 years studying under a shaman and fasting and praying and doing ceremonies and serving the people and learning the stories and learning the song. You're not qualified to teach an Indigenous studies class. You have to have a white PhD that actually supervises you when you teach. That kind of thinking still very much alive today. So these are barriers. And just knowing that they're there, I suppose, can help in some ways to try to work on them. What I want to talk about just a little bit, and as I'm kind of heading towards the end of the story here, is some of the pathways that we think, that in our experience, can help to really open up the doors so that you can have processes of indigenization and reconciliation going on in your community, in your institution, wherever it is that you want to create this. I mean, you have to create it somewhere. It's not just a theory, it's about relationships and with people. So it's wherever you are able to do it, that's where you do it. So the first one is having learning processes, learning the history, learning the culture, learning the background. And there's a lot of material available. There's books, there's videos, there's courses, lots of them, many of them. And if you need connections to these things, yeah, I mean, we can help you to do that. I can work with Shelley and connect you to them. But I mean, a lot of our Indigenous friends now say they don't want to come and speak to Indigenous groups and tell you about the history and what happened in the past, because that knowledge is already out there. It's not our responsibility to educate you. It's your responsibility to educate yourself. Now, everybody doesn't have that view, but they get tired of being called on to say the same thing over and over again about what happened to them and their children and their, and so on. Second strategy, establish relationships of true friendship. Now, a friendship is something that isn't just, would you come to my meeting and talk? A friendship is way different from that. A friendship is, we laugh together, we eat together, we visit each other's families, we know each other's stories, we cry together, we truly care for one another, and we'll do whatever it takes to make that caring live. We'll work on it. When there is love, nothing is too much trouble, and there is always time. The core of this is love. I just want to, some of you may have heard Payam Akavan talking a couple of years ago on the CBC Massey Lecture Series, on a 5-part series about human rights around the world and why human rights standards, human rights commissions, all the stuff that's going on wasn't stopping genocides and atrocities from happening. It's still happening. In the end, he concluded that the reason why, despite the UN Declaration on Human Rights and all the work that's gone on, the reason why this stuff still wasn't penetrating and changing things at a ground level in many places is because we don't care enough. If you really cared about what was going on in Rwanda when the genocide was happening, why the hell didn't we intervene? I mean, seriously intervene. Why didn't the United Nations intervene? If we don't really cared about the misery and the plight of thousands upon thousands of refugees on the move, trying to get out of Africa or out of the Middle East into Europe, and the doors are being slammed in their face, or coming up from Latin America because their countries are unlivable, we would, if we cared, we'd do something. We find ourselves, our hands tied. And he says, because we don't care enough. A third sort of pathway is dedicating yourself to a principle of service above self. That my way of trying to bring this about is I'm going to serve these people until they trust me. I'm going to work. Like there's really some dear friends of ours that live in Victoria that wanted to work with Indigenous communities around Alert Bay. And the one guy's a doctor, and he had actually been a doctor in Alert Bay from time to time. So he knew the community there. So him and his wife and kids and another family and their kids, every time that community had an event like a powwow or a giveaway or a feast or anything, they drove up from Victoria. It was a long drive. You got to take a ferry and everything. They drove up there and they worked in the kitchen and they took care of the children. They just served. And they did that for a couple of years. And the people then started to recognize them and really appreciate them. And it really made a big difference. Another strategy, you got to create circles, core groups of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the same circle. How you get there, you got to build the trust. You got to find people that'll sit there with you, even if it's only 2 of you or 3 of you. But that's what you got to do. And you work till you get to the point where you can do that. And that circle will bring things that you could never bring on your own. And those indigenous people in that circle will bring others. And it will begin to change. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do. Here's something that we're doing in our hometown here. The Rotary Club's working on it, but so are a lot of other people. If you drive into our town, there is no sign that there's any indigenous people living anywhere around there. In fact, our town is famous for the Cowboy Museum, which was built about 15 years ago. So the townspeople thought it was just appropriate, maybe 20 years ago, to build a big museum to celebrate the history of their town. And there wasn't a mention of indigenous people who live about, I don't know, 20 kilometers down the road, and whose land that was long time before these European people came there, and who helped those European people get settled there. No mention of them. There's just a cowboy and a big statue on the hill. And then this big museum. So there's no indigenous businesses. There's no indigenous services. There's no signs, historical signs. There's nothing. And so indigenous people, when they come to town, they say, we don't see ourselves reflected here anywhere. And in fact, this dear elder, that dear friend of ours that I was mentioning before that was speaking at that meeting, she and her son were driving in town, going to go to the Safeway, I guess. They were going to go to the store. And they were walking across a crosswalk. And this guy drove a pickup truck quite fast right at them and just stopped inches from them. And then gave them the finger. And it just, of course, it rattled them, it frightened them. There are still people like that around in the town. So after the coursework, the 7-module course that we did with the town leaders, we've now proposed that we're going to make working with indigenous partners, we're doing what's called indigenous space making. We're making a space, we're making a place. We're creating something like a friendship center, a building that is run by indigenous people to create their own programming, to have their own presence, so that when their people come to town, they got a place to go. And we'll support them. We'll work with them any way they can. But whatever they want to make out of this place, it's going to be their place. And we're raising money to do that. And it's really an idea that's caught the imagination of many, both indigenous and non-indigenous people in the area, and it's building momentum. It's going to take a lot to do that, but we're committed to doing it. There's lots you can do, and I don't think you have any lack of imagination. There's gazillions of ideas. I guess I just want to close by saying that if you have the right heart and the right spirit, you're going to be able to move forward with this. And one time, quite a few years ago now, a bunch of us were asked to help with, one of the large reserves in Canada was having a big problem with HIV/AIDS. And many young people were actually contracting AIDS. And the leadership was obviously very worried about this. And so they asked us if we could come and help and figure out what to do. So we went. And we really weren't getting anywhere. We could hardly get people to talk. We tried to have meetings and people weren't even coming to the meetings. And at one point along the way, I went to an elder and I said, we don't know what to do. I don't understand what to do. It's a hard problem. We don't know. And he said, well, I don't know much about all that. He said, but I'll tell you a story. Okay, so here's the story he told. A long time ago, when the world was very, very young, the creator of all good things used to gather the people together for meetings in order to talk about things. And they used to gather under that sacred tree of life that overshadowed everybody, made them like the children of one father and one mother, made them safe, made them comfortable. And so when the people would come to these meetings, oh, they would all come. The deer people and the elk people and the snake people and the buffalo people and the eagle people and the salmon people, all the people would come, even the human people. So one day the Creator put out a call and he asked for the people to come for a meeting. And so they all showed up and they're all gathered around and kind of talking excitedly, and they didn't quite know what was going on because they didn't see the Creator there, and they were wondering what was going on. And then the Creator came into the meeting, and they say that whenever the Creator came into those meetings, the whole place would be filled with quiet and warmth and love and light. And everybody got really quiet. And he welcomed all of them. And he said, my dear friends, you may be wondering why I called this meeting, why I brought you here. He said, if you look around, you'll see that all of us are here, but not the human people. And the reason for that is because what I want to ask you is I've got a problem, and the problem concerns those human people. You see, I have a gift that I want to give to them. This is a gift that's so powerful that if they get their hands on it before they're ready to use it, they could destroy everything. This is a gift that with this gift, they're going to be able to make things new. They're going to be able to repair and heal what was broken. This is the gift of creation itself. My problem is, if I give this gift before they're ready, who knows what they're going to create? Who knows what they're going to do? Because sometimes they run off all excited with their ideas. They get all up in their heads and they forget about things. Or they get all excited on an emotional level, but they just don't bring their heads and their hearts together. They're just out of balance like that. So here's my question. Where can I hide this gift until the people are ready to use it? Well, they all began to talk at once, and Bear said, well, I know, we could take it into the heart of the mountains, and there's caves in there. And in the caves, deep in the caves in there, and it's so dark, human people aren't going to go in there. Creator said, no, actually, they're going to go in there because they like those shiny rocks. They're going to go in there and they're going to dig and they're going to find it there. So we can't put it there. So Buffalo said, well, how about I take it to the center of the prairies? It's just flat and grass and wind and sky. There's nothing there. There's just nothing. I'll just take it to Regina. Who would ever go there? And the Creator said, yeah, no, they're going to go there too. They're going to build roads and towns and farms and everything. You can't take it there either. They're going to find it there. And Salmon said, all right, then how about the bottom of the sea? There's trenches down there, deep valleys. And inside those valleys, there's caves. They're never going to go in there. They never find it. I'll take it way down in there and hide it. Creator said, no, they're very curious, these human people. They're going to make a machine so they can go down in there, so they can look at everything. Then Eagle said, all right, then, I know. I will take it to the highest mountain of them all. Way up there so high, there's no air. They can't breathe up there. And then he said, wait a minute, even better. I will take it to the moon. They're not going to go to the moon. And the Creator said, no. He said, one day they're going to go to the moon even. You can't take it there. And all the while this conversation is going on, there was this one old lady who hardly ever talked at meetings. She was very shy. She couldn't see very well. It's Grandmother Mole. And she made her way up to where the Creator was standing, and she tugged on his robe. And he got down there with his ear, and he listened to her. And she whispered in his ear. And when she got done, the Creator began to smile, and he said, Grandmother Mole has given me a wonderful idea. She said, put it inside of their hearts, because they're never going to look there. And that's what they did. Now, to remind you that this was the answer that this old man was giving me about how do you do this thing that's so hard. Put it in their hearts. They're never going to look there. And what I understood from that in my own life, there's probably 1,000 meanings to these stories, was that I had to go and speak with people from my heart, with love and from my heart, and really with all my spirit, with all my will, had to convey to them, look, I need your help. I don't know what to do. Can you help me? Can we do this together? And that's what I did, and other people did. And pretty soon the elders came out and they helped us. The big problem was, in that case, in that community, they never talked about anything to do with sex in mixed company. The women could meet with the elder women. The boys could meet with the elder men. And that was fine. And that's how we were able to start getting things going. So again, I thank you for taking the time to listen to me. These are just some ideas. I'm sure you got lots of ideas of your own. We all have ideas. Thank you very much.
So there's a lot to think about. Maybe we could either, how do we do this? Where is the
Do you
hand?
guys want to talk about anything?
Yeah, I'm just looking to see how to get people, if they just want to put their hand up, they can
How
use.
much time do we have, Shelley?
The library's open until 8, and Erin has kindly said that she would stay till 8.
Thank you.
So we've got 25 minutes, and maybe either you could just raise your hand, or you could use the reactions down below, and I'm looking for a hand up, and I don't see one.
If you press reactions, a little dialogue box
There
comes
it
up,
is.
as raise
No.
hand is one of them.
Yeah, now I can see the
Even
raise.
if you raise your hand like this, there's a guy in there.
Yeah, yeah. So just maybe just if, because we've only got the 25 minutes left, and try to keep remarks concise until we make sure everybody's gone around, and then come around to you again. But okay, so JJ, your hand was up. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to thank our guest for his wonderful presentation. And my question is, what right do we have to ask Indigenous people to come into our circle? Is it the 21st century time to start a new circle?
So the question is, whose circle is it?
Yeah.
That's why I said nothing about us without us.
Mhm.
So we say to our Indigenous colleagues, we're trying to build a circle with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together. Will you help us?
Mhm.
But first you have to have the relationships so that people are willing to do it. But it's not bringing them into our space anymore to do that. It's creating something together. That's what we're trying to do. And I think that seems to work. I mean, well, that's a very important question. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, anyone else? Kathy, you're on mute, so you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, can do.
Not very good at this technology stuff. I want to say thank you as well, because it's very comforting to hear people speak about the way folks communicate in different ways, and having an understanding of that communication skill really makes a difference. I know for myself, speaking about a message I'm trying to convey, I somehow speak more in pictures, and I think I have to, I somehow expect people to glean out of what I'm saying, what I'm trying to say. And it's difficult. Of course, my First Nations families and friends have no trouble, but that's not the majority of people that I speak with. So it's challenging, having a different way of thinking, and often a similar way of thinking, but coming from place of different guidelines and values is really challenging. So, but I'm excited in some ways. I still hear a lot of people say, that was a long time ago, get with the program kind of thing.
Yeah.
More and more people are saying, I want to know you. I want to hear you and what you've experienced, and how can we move from here? How can we go forward? And just the very fact that people hold and value just that question itself is, to me, it's been a real turning point in my life and in many people's lives. And I'm really excited about the fact that we are now speaking about what is going on today in many people's lives. And I think the general stand is that most people have an illusion that their lifestyle and their circumstances are the same for everybody, and that's really challenging for sure. So yeah, I don't know all of you here. I'm sure that there's a lot more people that are of both cultures, like I am. So it's hard to have a foot in both worlds. It's very challenging at times. But I think the people who have their feet in both worlds have an opportunity right now that is essential to our well-being and the well-being of our future. So patience is, I think what we really need is a lot of patience. And the other thing that excites me is that there's far more going on than we can see or understand. And to just trust that, just know that we're all changing, we're all healing in our own ways, and it's a good time to be. I really believe so, and I really appreciate everything that has been said. Thank you. Thank you.
Did you have any response, Michael, anything you'd like to say?
Want to have coffee?
Yeah, there's cookies too.
I mean, what? She said it great. I mean, whatever. Yeah.
Erin, was that you wanting to say? Your hand was up.
I just had a question, two things. One, I want to quickly say before anybody pops off, the Kootenai Library Federation, with our library and the other libraries in the area, we'll be hosting a discussion with two local Indigenous artists next month. That's November 19th. And that is with Marilyn James and Therese Alexis, and they're the authors of Not Extinct, Keeping the Sinixt Way. So that's, and those are some local authors to us. So part of keeping a circle going. So keep an eye out for that, and I'll send some more information out about that. And then quickly, I just wanted to ask, I've been reading this book recently, and it's a collection of essays by Indigenous authors. And in one of them, the author, Rachel Yanacht George, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but she discusses how, in her view, reconciliation is another act of colonization, and in the thought that reconciling is telling something that was once together and broken apart, bringing it back together. And in her essay, she's saying that they weren't one culture, and you're telling us to now finally just be assimilated into this white culture. And is this do you see some kind of bristling against specifically the concept or word of reconciliation? Or, I mean, I think it was beautiful what you said, mostly that we have to use our heart. And in that perspective, I can see how, in terms of being people together, we need to reconcile. But is there kind of a cultural, have you heard this kind of sentiment before?
Sure. I mean, if two human beings meet for the first time, they're from different worlds, and they meet. At that point, they're just human beings meeting. And what happens after that can distort that and undermine that relationship to the point where one or the other becomes dehumanized and subjugated. To me, I mean, well, first of all, the word reconciliation isn't the concept, as I said before, is not something white people dreamed up. It was something in the prophecies from a long time ago that indigenous people were told that the people from the four directions, all of them are brothers and sisters from the Creator. And you need to work hand in hand with all of them. So if that's been messed up by something, that needs to be fixed. Canada was founded, as I said, on a foundation of what today, well, I mean, clearly what genocide, crimes against humanity. And the process of reconciliation is going to mean restitution. Indigenous people need to have enough land and enough resources so that they can have a sustainable economic life, for example. They don't have to live in poverty. They need to have space where they can create their own societies, their own nations within our circle of Canada. For the most part, Indigenous people in Canada want to be part of the circle of Canada. They don't want to separate and be their own self. There are maybe those who do. But there's a lot of anger, especially in, I can say this also, that Indigenous academics tend to take a little bit, well, academics will pick at things. I mean, I think that that's a point of view, and there's validity to that point of view, but I think it's missing the really important thing. And that important thing is we are all human beings. We are all children of the Creator. This is an Indigenous idea, but it's also a universal human idea. You find it everywhere. How in a world are we going to solve problems like climate change or global migration or any of the other things that are happening if we don't work together and create a common spirit among us? So movement in that direction has to be good. I don't care what you call it. I guess that's my answer.
It's beautiful.
But
thank you.
somebody want to take that apart or something? Go ahead.
Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? I'm not sure, Linda, you might be able to help me with this because I did listen to that. I listened to that video from ABS, but I think at one point the woman who was speaking, who I think she teaches at UBC. Is that right? I think her point was there was a problem with reconciliation because it wasn't necessarily done in the way Indigenous cultures would have done it. And so in some sense there, it was
Yeah, I mean,
not doomed to failure because I think it's something to work on. But
I mean,
it was
supposing that I'm your estranged husband or something, and I used to beat you up, and then I disappeared for 5 years, and then I come back and say, okay, well, let's start over. Let's reconcile. And you've just barely escaped the psychological damage that happened from all the abuse. And then I say, well, let's reconcile. I'll move back in. And I start defining the terms of how it's going to go. That's how a lot of Indigenous people are experiencing this idea.
Mhm.
So they resist it.
Mhm.
But I mean, you can't blame them.
Mhm.
But at the same time, Indigenous spiritual leaders and visionaries and leaders of thought for centuries have been telling the people we're all one. The people of the four directions, black, white, yellow, and red. The medicine wheel represents us all. So I mean, we're in a difficult historical moment, but I think that the way through is heart to heart.
Mhm. Linda?
So you were talking about Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond,
Mm.
and her point, and it's really in line with everything Michael has been saying, is that there can be no reconciliation without justice. And
Yeah.
that's really what came from what I heard her saying, and certainly everything Michael's been talking about.
Mhm.
So the importance of justice to unity. We know that we cannot have unity without justice, and without unity, without recognizing each other as brothers and sisters, we cannot come together and solve all of the problems that we have as one humanity.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was saying.
Mhm.
It looks like Vicky, you have your the icon up, and Kathy, I think you're putting your hand up as well.
Oops.
So
Oh, there's Vicky. Okay.
Hi, Michael. I was just attending the Harper Mountain gathering on Zoom last week, and there was a lot of talk about the rising up of the Indigenous voice. And similar to what Linda just said, justice will bring us to unity, and unity will bring us to peace. Like, it's essential that the voice of the Indigenous people around the world be heard, of course, around the world, not just here. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, because I know you've been in many places around the world, what you are seeing in other parts of the world in terms of the Indigenous people rising up.
Well, it really depends on where you go. Some of the strongest Indigenous movements are in Central and Latin America, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, parts of Mexico, where they've been at it for 50 years, and they've never given up their quest for justice. You know, they've been, when the Spanish came to Latin America, many Indigenous people kind of tried to, it's such a bad process of colonization that a lot of Indigenous people tried to become assimilated. You know, most of Mexico, you look at people in Mexico right now, and if you've ever been there and you can see the population, like there's, I don't know, 75% or whatever of the people have Indigenous blood or more, maybe 90%. I mean, it's a nation of Indigenous people. Half of them don't even know that, their background. So there's this long history of Indigenous people responding in different ways to the oppression that they've got, from trying to disappear and assimilate, to trying to get along, to trying to resist, to trying to collaborate. There's that full spectrum of people are doing all of these things. And that's happening in Mexico, it's happening in Bolivia, it's happening in Ecuador. Right now, we are working with Mayan people in Belize, in southern Belize, along the Guatemala border. Now, this is a particular situation. It's 500 years of colonization. The instruments of colonization were the government and the Spanish imperial government, and then the British came along, but the churches also had a big role. And so for most of the Mayan communities, no matter whether they're in Belize or Mexico or Honduras, wherever they are, it was the Catholic Church. That's because that's who the Spanish brought the Catholic Church. So in the communities we are working with now, which is only 3 villages, but we're building up to do a much bigger project over time. But you have to kind of work we do. It's very slow and it takes time to build capacity. So the women are more backwards in terms of their freedom to be themselves and to be organized and to realize their true potential. The women are kept down more there than they are in the communities in Pakistan where we work.
Mm.
In Pakistan is many places, not just one place. Some of the communities, in some of the areas in Pakistan, women can't even come out of the house.
Mm.
But lots of areas of Pakistan, women are organized and they're out there and they're doing things. And we're working with them there. Here in these communities, these Mayan communities, they're indigenous people, all right? They speak their languages and everything, but the women have never been educated, never been organized. Almost none of them have ever gone to high school. And slowly we're working with them to try to build that capacity, and it's beginning to happen, and the men are welcoming it because the women are earning money and bringing it into the family. That's one wedge that you can get to make change with that, is women have businesses and they make money. And then the men go, oh, well, look at that. Maybe I better give them a little space to do that. So, I mean, there's no one thing happening. There's a lot of different things happening, I guess. But almost everywhere, I'll just say this, almost everywhere, including in Canada, you can talk about building up Indigenous strength in communities and so on, but there is a fundamental learning process, a capacity creation process that needs to go on, starting with the spiritualization, the consciousness raising of the individual, and moving outwards into social action, into the community, into collaborative activities, into development, social and economic development. That's how it happens. And you have to, now, if that's not happening, you got to figure out a way to get it to happen. It's amazing what an educational process that wakens people up to their own potentialities and to the possibilities of working together, and to how you work together to create unity among yourselves, how that can have a huge influence on the progress that people make or they don't make. And we're seeing it now in Belize, where we're using the same process that we used in Pakistan. And we've been kept away from them for almost a year, 2 years, because of the pandemic. And we just visited there. And the women are self-forming women's organizations when that was unheard of in 50 years before, just from the learning that they're doing. So, I don't know, it's a very big subject.
So we're getting close to the end of our time. Kathy, if you could just make a really short comment.
I'll be really quick. As Indigenous people, knowing people all over Canada, I have to quickly say that if we could take and really examine Indian affairs and look at the way we are segregated, you can see reservations in the South in certain areas that are doing really well because people got some business together, but there's still a reservation. Everyone gets a piece of the pie, but no one owns anything. You don't own your house. You know, like we talk about water because water is something you can all relate to. But our communities all across Canada are different than the rest of Canadians. You don't buy a house. You can't build a house because your kids got together and now they're having grandkids. There's only Indian Affairs controls it all. It's unequal, it's unbalanced, it's still set up in a way that creates a disparity and depression in people's lives. And first off, Indian Affairs is the most responsible for the genocide that has gone on, whether it's been financially or socially. The whole structure rests at the feet of Indian Affairs. And if we can't make some changes there and deal with our politicians, I'm telling you, if we stood up to do this, you would find our First Nations people standing, because that's something we can all relate to. Let's have an equal based stand on. That's what we need. We're not coming from the same place.
Yep.
We're not coming from the same place at all. And if people in our communities here in the boundary continue to think, well, why don't those people work? Why don't those people pay their taxes? Why am I spending my taxes to make it so they can get this funding and that funding? People don't understand the picture at all today. No one talk about the past. It's not this, there's not a level playing field here. And we need to see it and know it. And we need to really work together to make those changes. And if you want to talk about justice, why are we still supporting a government that has an Indian Affairs over top of every First Nations reservation? Please, I can't say this enough. We're all waiting. We can't work with this when our hands are tied. Our hearts are tied. Our children are dying. I have friends that are priests in the North in the Anglican Church. Every time they come to a conference to deal with this very issue, they don't know whose kid's going to be dead when they get home. We live with it daily. And it's huge. And it's a disparity that is beyond most people's understanding in this country.
That is truth. Here's just a little fact. The Canadian government spends $20 billion a year, they tell us, on Indigenous communities, on reserves and so on. Of that, roughly 18 billion never leaves Ottawa. All that money is spent on their bureaucracy.
You can't even fix your house. You've got 5 generations living in a sweltering house that was inadequately built to start with. And if you want to go get building supplies and build a shed, the shed will be taken down because Indian Affairs didn't approve it. You know, people just don't understand. The living conditions are insane. But water is something, it's like children. Water, everybody understands what it's like to have a drink. And everybody understands how awesome little children are. It's basically all the tools we have to work with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. It's just gone past 8 now. Michael, do you want to just briefly talk about, you sent a document to me and we were thinking about using it as a another gathering to read together, to study together, just to keep the conversation ongoing. Do you want to say a few words about it? I'm not sure how to do that, except perhaps if people messaged me with their name and contact, and if we organize something, we can then get it together. I'm not sure if that's something we could do in collaboration with the library. I'd have to talk to you, Erin, about it. But that's all I can think of right now, is if you would just message me, and then I'd know who was interested, and maybe we can get a little group chat going together. Do you want to say something about that, Michael, about that document?
It's just some notes as a part of a program. I mean, the conditions that she described on reserves, Kathy described on reserves, I mean, it's deadly accurate. Now, some communities are responding to that and are able to do something about it, and they are making improvements, but it's against a lot of odds. But it's absolutely true what she says. So we're doing a training course for Indigenous managers, people who are working as managers in First Nations. And sometimes they come in from the city and they don't know anything about those conditions. And yet those Indigenous governments are trying to struggle with those conditions. So this is a document that says, well, this is what you're going to face as a manager. These are the issues with housing, with food security, with education, with health, with all this tremendous backlog of issues. This is the struggle. This is where those things come from. The problems come from, and this is what Indigenous governments are now trying to address. That's what that document is. It's just a background document to actually expose some of the things that she was talking about. Like when enough Canadians stand up to our government and say, dismantle that system, it is apartheid, it is criminal. That's the only time it's going to go. And that means Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together. And it's not, doesn't matter whether you're in this political camp or that or not or nothing. It's just justice. It's just our country. What do we want our country to be?
So when I read about the Indian Act, and I was, obviously really shocked, because it was like treating Indigenous people like children. And I asked an Indigenous friend why didn't they just ask for it to be gone? And his response was, because there are things in there that help us, and there's no trust. We're afraid that we'll lose those things that help us, and we've already lost so much. So I think that's the only way then to get rid of it is if Indigenous and non-Indigenous work together to do it.
There's an awful lot in this topic.
Yeah.
I think you should have Kathy lead a session.
We should be in touch, Kathy. Yeah. Well, thank you. We've kept Erin over time. Thank you for your patience, and thanks so much for spending this evening with us, Michael.
Quite welcome. It was a pleasure to meet you all.
Okay.
Hope to see you again. If there's something I can do, please let me know.
Yeah, I might be in touch with you if you've got some suggestions for more reading material. And
Well, there's a lot of that around.
yeah, I think people are starting to delve into it on their own already. So, okay, well, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.